together, what do you get? A long story.
You need this one
Did I well?
here. Great choice.
Well, it's good to be.
Wow.
You have to turn it down.
No.
You can hear me all over town now. Good. Well, I'm supposed to be retired. You know, that's on paper, but I'm still on the go. I see a few of my old congregational people from the Presbyterian Church sitting in front of me, and I think I would recognize some of them if I saw them on the street. A few years ago, some of our group from the 46th Fighter Squadron, which I was a part of, got together in Springfield, Illinois after 50 years of separation. There were four of us. One was from Denver, Colorado. Another one was from down in Texas. Another one was from Maryland. And another guy was from Minnesota, this guy here. And we had 3 days in which we did nothing but reminisce. And we went out to eat together. We almost slept together. It was fantastic, but I would never have known, except for one, if I had met him on the street. That's how much we had changed over 50 years. I was drafted in 1942, same year that you did, in September. A farm boy who didn't know anything about life out there except trucking. I was trucking for a couple of years with my brother. And then the war came along, we got drafted. You leave everything behind, and then you begin to take orders from not Dad anymore, but from Uncle Sam. And so this is where I started, and I'm in the process of writing up my whole military history for my son Bruce, who lives here in town. And it's through him that I'm here today. He invited me to come. And I have both of my boys here today. I see Don's here from Minneapolis. I'm so glad that some of you from the church I recognize from the past. Well, anyway, I'm not here to do a lot of extraneous talking. And I'm deciding as to where I should begin in this whole venture. Maybe I should begin with the uniform, as you were talking about. Mine is hanging right here. I don't have any ribbons on there. They're all in the box back home. Not too many of them, but some. This particular item has to do with 6 months of service. So this is 2.5 years of overseas. I spent quite a bit of time preparing in this country before I went overseas. I was with the 7th Air Force, and I have a jacket. I didn't bring that. I should have brought along. You can always maybe a jacket with all my information on it, which I was in the service. I was in the old Army Air Corps, World War II. Now it's a whole new structure. It's called the Air Force. And Bruce was in the Air Force. Don was in the Navy Air Wing. My grandson, Bruce's oldest son, also was in the Air Force. So we're 3 generations now within the Air Force, which is something I think we can feel a little bit proud of too. I also have the shirt here that go along with a pair of trousers. And this is my cap. And so I can't get into those things anymore. So I have to just use them for display. I'm going to talk about this rifle a little bit later because it has a history to it that I'd like to share with you.
A little bit too close.
A little bit too close. You were too far away and I'm too close. That's preachers for you, isn't it? Okay. I'd like to start out by saying that when I left for the service, I left Hinckley, Minnesota, Pine City, Minnesota, and rode a train, a troop train, all the way down to St. Petersburg, Florida. We were given exams first to find out what kind of a background we had, what we were able to do, if we were mechanics or what. So I ended up going to St. Petersburg for basic training. From there we went to Atlantic City for overseas training, and come to that a little bit later. But from St. Petersburg, Florida, after 3 weeks of basic training, I was shipped to Colorado, Buckley Field, Colorado, which was a school for armament on fighter airplanes. In other words, fighter and the bombers are 2 different types of airplanes. Fighter is an escort unit, can also do a lot of strafing, but mostly it was an escort vessel or a machine or vehicle to escort bombers on missions. And so from Colorado, I was there 6 weeks in training on guns, 50 calibers, and also machine guns of other kinds, also on cannons. We had a lot of cannon service. So after I graduated from school there, we went on to Atlantic City for overseas training. A lot of drill, a lot of gunnery, and so forth. That was in January, and it was very cold on the Atlantic seaboard. Then I got a little reprieve and went back home. For about 3 weeks or so, vacation, we called it furlough. Went back to Atlantic City. Morton got back and they shipped us clear across the country by troop train, clear to California, Stockton, California. Some of you guys are nodding your head, you know what that's all about. So we shipped out on an old passenger ship called the USS Loreline. That was stripped of all of its niceties, and they put in canvas bunks, 5 stacked and 5 high, so they could transport all the men they could possibly get on there. We left at night, so we wouldn't be detected by any enemy people around. Furthermore, we were out just that first night, and by morning, I was feeling pretty sick. And I didn't know what I'd eaten that would make me so sick. I began asking a few other guys, I said, "No, you guys eat the same thing I did? I was sick." "Oh, you're seasick." Yeah, I guess we were. So I fed the supper to the sharks out there. All night long, didn't get any sleep. You know what that's about. From there on, of course, we landed in Hawaii. And I was in Hawaii unassigned to any unit. A group of us were called unassigned personnel. So we were waiting to be assigned to some squadron somewhere out in the Pacific. So I was there 3 weeks. You know what we did in those 3 weeks? We unloaded beer out in the mountains just to keep the troops, I guess, in beer. Furthermore, I also became a waiter at an officer's quarters. So they had nice meals for the officers. I had a nice ribbon across here, you know what you call these things, these white things. So we had to serve the officers meals, you know, the plates, and like a waiter. So we got a lot of experience in all kinds of things except the military. From there on, of course, after that, one day someone came and told me, an officer came and told me, "Nelson, you are assigned to the 46th Fighter Squadron, 7th Air Force, located on Canton Island, South Pacific." Where's that? On the equator. Ooh. Said, "Be down at Hickam Field in the morning by 7 o'clock. So we took off on the Jeep. Another driver took me down there. I was all alone, except the driver. Got on this B-24, which was converted to a passenger airplane, sitting on the floor, not in nice seats, but on the floor, about 30 of us. On the B-24 bomber, we got down there in the morning, the next morning. Actually, by morning, we flew all night. And you know, I looked out the window and I saw something floating down on the ocean, water, and I thought, what in the world is that down? It looked like somebody threw out some garbage. One of the guys says, "That's not garbage, that's Canton Island." So that's where I spent 11 months, on that little atoll called Canton Island, which was supposed to be a garbage place down there. Canton Island was a place where the United States Air Force kept a base for 2 reasons. One was to protect travel, U.S. troops and merchandise between the United States and Australia. The second reason was they were training pilots so they could be accurate in their bombing experience when they got in combat. So we had all kinds of targets out in the ocean that were placed out there by other boats. And then we would load what you call practice bombs and practice shells into the airplane. There we had P-39 Air Cobras. And let me tell you, if you ever worked on one of those things, you would never want to become an armor again. You had a cannon that shot in the middle. The airplane had the engine behind the pilot in the middle of the airplane. This airplane was made by the Bell Aircraft Corporation. So the engine, big 12-cylinder, sat behind the pilot. The nose had all the guns and the cannon. So the cannon receiver sat between the legs of the propeller, of the pilot, excuse me. So he could look down, and there was a whole receiver, and the barrel shot right out this way to the front end. Plus, there were two 50 caliber machine guns in the nose. And they had to be synchronized so that the bullets fired between the blades of the propeller. It was a three-bladed propeller. So we had what we call a wire that came up from the gearbox in front where the propeller turned. And that wire had to go clear out here and fire it into what they call a firing pin unit on the receiver of the gun. So that would fire at the same time, but precisely so that the bullet would be beyond the propeller by the time the propeller got there. If you don't think that was a headache to keep that kind of an airplane from shooting any holes to the propeller, we had two airplanes during that time we were there that got 50 caliber shells right through the hub of the propeller. What did we get for that? KP for a week. Even though we didn't know how it happened, whether it was hang fire on the shell or whether it was a miscalculation by some armor. And by the way, I was in charge of an airplane. Every one of us armors had one airplane that we had to sign off that was ready to go. We had to load all the ammunition. We had to load also the cameras. By the way, every airplane had a camera. This way you could check your accuracy. You could check what the accuracy of your target was in shooting at it. And then we had to load bombs too. So that was my job on one airplane. And then if one fellow got through a little early, he'd help the other guy out. So this is how we worked together. We were there for 11 months. In between times, we went swimming in the lagoon. Saltwater lagoon, we picked up shells, live mussel shells, and we would bury them in the sand for a week until they died. Then we clean them out. We made necklaces, spare time, out of airplane wiring and glue and cotton. I sent home at least 4 or 5 of them to my mother. And she sent one to Sweden, to my cousins in Sweden. And I was visiting over there in 89, or 87, excuse me. My cousin wrote this out. Can you remember this? I said, how do you get that? Your mother sent it to me during World War II. Strange things happen in wartime too, don't they? Well, anyway, we left Camp 9 after 11 months, went on a Dutch freighter for 3 weeks along the equator. It was steamy hot. We get a squall of rain would come over and get the deck all wet, and then it would steam off of there. It was miserable. The food was terrible. Then we got seasick. And the guys who didn't get seasick would come along and wave a pork chop in front of us. That's what you call pouring salt in the wound, I guess. Well, anyway, we went to Fiji Island, and we ended up on Macon Island, near Tarawa. Those of you remember Tarawa was one of the most bloody battles in the Pacific up to that time. Macon Island was just a few miles away, and that was also conquered by the Marines. Our runway was made out of steel that was laid there by the Seabees. It was just too soft a place to land an airplane. So they put metal in the runways. So they were laid by the Seabees. We had the P-39 Air Cobras still working there, that place. And we slept then pretty much in tents. But I spent most of my time at night in the trenches that were dug for communication lines on the island. That island was really beat up. The American bombers had bombed that place until there was nothing but stumps left. The palm trees were all shattered. Every bit of vegetation looked like somebody gone through there with a thrashing machine. It was just a miserable place. But every night, the Japs would come from the Kwajalein Islands and bomb us. So I spent a lot of time in those trenches. One morning I got up, and they'd been bombing that night, something terrible. I didn't know whether I was going to make the morning or not because bombs were falling all around. And you know how you feel like at that time? You feel like you're the target. You feel like you're going to be hit next. So I buried my rifle down in the sand and everything else in there, and seemingly just as far down as I could get in the sand. Well, there was a big piece of shrapnel laying on my bunk because we slept outside many times because it was too warm in the tent at night. That's the closest I got up, and I thank the Lord that I was still alive, because shrapnel had been ruining trees all that night too. And that was part of the battle there. We were there 6 weeks, and then we shipped back to Hawaii. We had to climb a big ladder up to an aircraft carrier, which our ships were loaded on a Navy aircraft carrier. Took us back to Hawaii. And I was in Hawaii for almost a year, in which we were training on P-38 Lightning fighters. They were made, I don't remember exactly what company made that. Lockheed, there we are. Double boom. We had the centerpiece was all armament. And the engines were a 2-engine unit. They were the nicest airplanes to work on. You had to climb up a ladder because they were sitting high. There was a tricycle landing gear on them, just like the P-38s or P-39s were. 4 machine guns out of that nose. And we would load those. We'd have to have them loaded, and also cameras. And this was all training in Hawaii. I can remember one incident that happened one morning. Getting ready for takeoff. It was a little foggy that morning. One pilot got mixed up, or didn't get these orders right, and he took off when all the planes were sitting in line ready to take off. He took off from behind. He ruined half the squadron, chopping them all up by his propellers as he went through there. Just as a mistake by the orders, or for some reason or other, we don't know yet. I guess never did find out what happened, but we sure wrecked a lot of our P-38 flight that day. By the way, in Hawaii, I went up in one of those airplanes with the pilot. Went through all the maneuvers, diving and climbing and maneuvering and whirling and everything else. I lost my breakfast. I wasn't used to that. He was used to that, the pilot. That was fun, rolling around up there in the P-38 fighter. So that was Hawaii. Then we found out that Iwo Jima had been conquered. So next thing you know, our 46th Fighter Squadron got orders to go to Iwo Jima. So we were loaded on what you call a personnel carrier, quite a large ship. And we were on for at least 2 or 3 weeks on board, because you had to go this way to avoid what you call submarine activity. So we ended up on Iwo Jima on March of 1945. It was cold, it was wet, it was miserable. And we had to go on shore in what you call landing craft. The front end flies down on the shore, and you walk out, you park on there, your backpack and everything else. That's how we landed on Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is really called the Sulphur Island in Japanese. There's a lot of sulfur springs, so all of our water was brackish. Couldn't shower in clean water over there. But anyway, that was another place that looked like it had been beat up with a sledgehammer. They had bombed Mount Suribachi for 3 months before we got there. Another experience we had there was, as soon as we got on shore, the personnel said, do not walk all over on the island because there are landmines all over, and you might get killed. Some of the men did. We have designated areas where you can walk. You just stay on those and you'll be okay. You know what some of the first duties I had over there? He gave us a pair of rubber gloves, big gauntlets like this. Big dump trucks came by. We picked up dead Japanese soldiers, loaded them on the dump truck. Dump truck would take off up into a higher hill where there was a bulldozer. Would trenched out a great big area, just lifted the truck or the box and slid all those Japanese bodies into a big trench. The bulldozer would cover them up and go back for another load. We couldn't bury them fast enough, so there were a lot of big flies about this size. We call them boat flies. You couldn't eat a decent meal because the flies were all over the place. And we lived on K rations and C rations for about 3 weeks at least over there in Iwo Jima. We had a lot of shells that were fired in by the big battleships, 16-inch guns. 16-inch guns is a pretty good sized projectile, about that long. That had not been fired. I mean, they had not ignited when they got there. Some of them had, of course, I don't remember what it was. So we stayed away from that. But I remember one morning, we had an ammunition truck that was sitting out on the island someplace waiting to be unloaded. We had flares. Some people would take off on flares to make sure that you knew where you were going at night. One of those flares landed on this ammunition truck. That whole truck exploded, and I thought the whole island would disappear. It was a terrible boom. The whole works of hell. That was one experience we had over there. Then we had also, of course, our flight came in, and so we had to get ready for much of my activity on Iwo Jima, for us at least, was 2 things. One was to serve as escort for the B-29 bombers that flew from Tinian, Guam, and Saipan. And wave after wave after wave all morning, beginning at daylight until probably about 11 o'clock. Nothing but black skies and clouds. I thought to myself, I hate to be in Japan. Those boys over there are really going to get it. And this happened for 2 or 3 weeks. It's not every morning, but I would say about, on average, about 3 times a week. And then after the alarms had gotten by, our fighters would take off, all loaded, ready for combat with the Japanese Zeros, or straight Navy yards or railroad yards over there. 600 miles between Iwo Jima and the area of Japan. A lot of our bombers that flew from Tinian and Saipan came back pretty well landed up from any aircraft fire. So they landed on Iwo Jima. So we had a lot of old bombers laying around. We took parts off of some to put on others so they could fly them back again. We lost a lot of our planes more by weather than we did by combat. That's hard to say, but one time we sent over most of our planes for our mission of Australia over Japan. They ran into a bad thunderstorm, and only half of our mission, half of our pilots and planes came back. We found out later from those who did come back as to what happened. They said the aircraft in this thunderstorm was such that they found themselves flying this way and that way and that way, every direction except the way they were supposed to go. So we lost a lot of airplanes and pilots that way by weather. We didn't have the weather predictions like they have today in those days either. So that made some difference. 6,000 soldiers were buried right next to our airfield across us. All of our soldiers and Marines were buried there who were killed. Altogether, if I remember correctly, there were something like 20,000 Japanese and American soldiers killed in Iwo Jima altogether. But when I landed there in March, one of our other jobs was not to pick up dead Japs, but later on we had to also become guards on what they call the old Army ducks. They would go out to the ship that had the cargo with food or ammunition or whatever. They would load the duck, and the driver of the duck would have a propeller in the back of the machine, of the vehicle, and then come to shore, and then you go on wheels. This was done at night, not during the day, but at night. So what did the rest of us have to do? We had to get on top of the cargo, because they were sure that the Japanese would capture them or shoot the driver, and then they'd capture the stuff on the truck. So we had to mount the truck with a rifle in hand and our helmets, and be aware that if any Jap came along, shoot them. Fortunate enough, I didn't have to do that, but I rode a lot of those ducks in, and it was not a very pleasant experience during that time. It was cold. We had to wear fur-lined sheets lining all the time. We slept in them as well as worked in them. I slept in Iwo Jima in a what you call it, not a trench, a foxhole, for 3 weeks, every night. All kinds of bombs falling and enemy fire going on every night. Not very pleasant. I did a lot of praying, believe me. And I buried almost my rifle every night in sand because that's the way you react to situations like that. They captured over 1,000 Japanese in those 9 months that I was there, alive. To say nothing about those who committed here and carried. Iwo Jima was a very expensive island for our American forces to capture. But nevertheless, it was possibly better than invading Japan about soldiers later. I know the atomic bomb was terrible. By the way, you know where I was that day? I was on top of a Russian ship that had been busted in half by our torpedoes, just off the bay. We were out there fishing, standing on top of an old cement platform there, fishing way down below. We didn't catch any fish because they didn't like the bait we were using, I guess. But the bullhorn on the island sounded off, and Hiroshima had been bombed by the atomic bomb. We have now entered the atomic age. Some of us who were out there, we just stood there and looked at each other. It was an awesome moment. And we were only 600 miles away. But also in Iwo Jima, I had the opportunity to go up to Mount Suribachi, and I stood right there where they raised the flag. Mount Suribachi. Quite an experience, to tell the truth. It's very emotional when you come to a place like that to know what happened at that time. Now, coming back, here's the rifle. They came out of a cave in Iwo Jima. I didn't go in and get it because I didn't want to risk my life just getting a gun. But somebody else did. And he pulled out of there about 20 of these out of a cave. This one has got a burn on it, and that's one flamethrowers. We got rid of a lot of Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima by a flamethrower. The Navy used them as well as the Army. And we would shoot a flame into these caves, and if anybody was in there, they were scorched, actually alive. Not very pleasant to talk about, but that's the way a lot of Japanese soldiers died. I also had a bayonet for this one, but in my moving it got lost someplace, or somebody felt that they needed it more negative, I guess. But anyway, this is a Japanese Arasaki. It's a 31 caliber. Compared to what our calibers would be, 1 caliber larger. You know why? So Japanese could use our ammunition, but we couldn't use theirs. What?
You can't use a 3006.
No, you can't use a 3006.
That's right.
I smuggled this thing, this one I sent home. This we could do it. But I smuggled home some ammunition. And you know how I did it? I put it in the boot, in the toe. So when the inspection came through, the boots were heavy anyway. They never really felt the weight of the boot. So when I got home in November of 1945, I didn't have anything else to hunt deer with this gun here. So I took this gun, I sighted it in, and it was accurate at 100 yards. So I'm now hunting with it with Jack ammunition. And you know, I shot a 6-point buck right here. The second day I was up. I'm standing on the railroad track, and I was looking at him. I took one shot, and he disappeared down over the bank. And over the fence, I took the second shot, and I thought to myself, yeah, that's the way these Japanese rifles are. They aren't worth much. But I went down there, and here was blood on the trees, and blood on the fence, and on the snow. I trailed that guy for a quarter of a mile into the thick poplar. He was shot right through the heart. And, every time his heart pumped, some more blood went out. So I got him with a Jack rifle and Jack ammunition. That's the only time I've ever used a gun for shot. It's been sitting in my gun rack ever since. And I thought I'd bring it today. Furthermore, here are some sights that the Japanese had on their gun. And that was used for aircraft. In case you estimated the distance of the aircraft was a little low, you could use this rifle to shoot at, maybe get them down. That's why these sights down here. It's a very crude gun. It wasn't made like our guns were made. I had a 30-06 Springfield and we only much of the time except when I got this one. So that's the whole history of that, I guess.
That's a single shot.
No, there's the magazine number here. And you can open it up too, right here.
Oh, how many about?
About 5 rounds.
5 rounds? Oh. That's
So you just load them down there, and then when you want to unload, you just unload it from the over here. So that's the history of that. Any other questions? Food was generally pretty good, yes.
Did the 3 weeks you were in the foxhole make you decide to go become a pastor?
Well, could have, I guess.
I also wanted to know, did you at all consider becoming a chaplain after you became a pastor?
I could have become a chaplain's aide in Hawaii when I was there. But I had already been trained on gunnery, and aircraft gunnery, so I felt maybe I should stay with it at the time. No, I felt called to the ministry while I was in high school.
Oh, you did study at that.
Well, I felt called to the ministry.
Oh.
I didn't prepare. Actually, I trucked for 5 years with my brother, trucking produce to Minneapolis and St. Paul with a truck. We did pretty well until the war came along. He got drafted. He wasn't killed, but he was an engineer in the South Pacific, in Australia and Guinea. This is where he's since passed away in '83. Cancer of the heart, of all things. But he and I were very close in many ways. We corresponded together. By the way, I just learned recently that I wrote to a friend of mine who is also now a pastor but retired, and he's failing in health very badly. In fact, I don't think he possibly will make the year in Malacca. And I wrote him many times, and he wrote to me. I didn't save his letters, but he saved all of mine. And now he's giving them back to me. And I read one the other day that he gave me earlier. And I was telling him all about the conditions of where we were. I couldn't tell everything because letters were censored, of course, back then. But I told enough so that it gave some idea of where we were and how we were living. And I treasured those letters. He said, I'm going to give you some more. So I said, I'll treasure them from now on. So I'll probably give them to my son after I'm through. So he'll have some mementos of World War II at that point. No, I spent time, I felt very definitely a call to the ministry while I was in high school. And I never got away from it. Somehow, here's something else I should mention. When the war was over, when the Pacific document was signed on the USS Missouri, of course the war was over, we were waiting to get back home. So we had nothing else to do, so they offered what they call the USOPI Institute. Some of you remember that, the USOPI Institute. USOPI is a lettering type of thing that has to do with a government-sponsored college course that you could take on short notice. And there were different areas in which you could enlist and take these. And you had professors who were either officers or enlisted men who would teach these courses. So I ended up signing up for English because I always felt that was probably a weak point when I needed that if I was going to be in the ministry. So I took the course and I got an A+. Never have I got an A+ before in English, in high school anyway. That was an indication to me, Lord, I guess you're going to be pursuing the ministry. I enrolled at Northwestern Bible School in Minneapolis later. And all the students, we were 300 of us, we had to take an English test to enter to get into the school, to see where we were in the area of English. And if you had passed the English test, they would put your name on the bulletin board out in the hallway somewhere. So I thought after the test was over, I don't know, I should go and look at it, but I'm afraid my name won't be there. I went over there, and there were 30 names out of 300. My name was one. All these to me were indications from the Lord, I guess this is where I want you. I've never looked back and said, I'm sorry, I ever took up the ministry. It has been a very rewarding piece of work. not always kind, not always something you always desire, like everybody else goes through the same thing too. Times I wish I was someplace else besides the ministry. I have to say the Lord has been very good. By the way, today I'm 82. Today I'm 82. I don't take a pill for anything. Any other questions?
I know the name of that ship you was on.
Your line?
It was a Palu lot. It was broken down in Hawaii, and I spent 30 days on that one.
Really? I got it. Boy, I came back on a destroyer escort. We flew from on the B-29 from Cannon Island, from Macon, Iwo Jima rather, to Saipan on the B-29. I sat up in a bubble up on the top of the ship in the airplane, where usually the navigator sits. We ran into a thunderstorm on the way. The old plane just kind of rocked a little bit, and the rain was coming down, the lightning was flashing. I'll never forget that experience.
And the old captain on there, he was Dutch, and he only could speak. And he would say about 6 o'clock every night, now is the time to dump the garbage.
Is that right? We came back on a destroyer escort 6 in convoy. We were out about 4 or 5 days. This was a whole week on board ship there again. And I think we were about 3 or 4 days out, and a huge storm came up in the Pacific. The waves were a half a mile high, I think. They were huge. They overlapped the ship, way on the bow. If you were out, you get washed off. So we were never out on deck during this time. The ship was rocking something terrible. We lost the gyroscope position in the ship. So the next morning, or whatever it was, and the storm let out, here we had all the other ships were gone except ours was sitting there out nowhere. So we finally got the gyroscope all fixed again, so we made it back there. Then I was in Hawaii for a week while they took the barnacles off the ship. The barnacles that gathered on the bottom of the ship while I was in the second. Then we came back on another ship to San Diego, and then by train back to Minnesota, Sparta, Wisconsin. Got out the same time you did. November of 1945. Okay, anything else? I hope I haven't given you too long a story.
Watch, it's still running, ain't it?
Say, Dad, you worked on P-51s too, I think, didn't you?
Oh, yes, that's
Yeah.
right. I mentioned, on Iwo Jima, we had P-51 Mustangs. They were the nicest ship to fly, and they were the nicest ship to work on. The mechanics said the same thing, so does armors. We had 3 machine guns in each wing. You could unload all those 1,500 guns in 30 seconds. If you kept the trigger down on the control unit in the cockpit. The barrels came back like this, and you did that, so we had to replace a lot of barrels. And then furthermore, when we force-headed the ship for a proper flight, we had to know how fast the airplane was going to fly. To fly at 350 miles an hour, we force-headed because it was going to fly this way. If it was only going to go, let's say, 200 miles an hour, we fly it so it was going this way. We learned a lot from it.
How long did it take to empty those guns when they fired them? How long did it take to empty out a P-51?
Well, you had all the guns going at the same time, and the trigger on the J-stick down, 30 seconds. 1,500 rounds. That's how fast they fight.
Incidentally, if you want to get nostalgic, over to Granite Falls, the guy over there has reconstructed the P-51.
Is that right?
It's worth a mint,
Sure.
and it's flyable.
In Granite Falls.
Yeah. And my former neighbor, Grove City, flew this P-51 in the Orient for the Flying Tiger. The guy took this airplane and flew it up to Ray up in Grand Rapids. Ray Calloway was his name. He's a 6.5-time ace. Ace is one that kills an enemy pilot, an enemy plane. He's done it 6.5 times. Anyway, he picked Ray up and they flew with it to Oshkosh, Wisconsin. So we had a Ray autograph thing because the airplane increased $8,000 in value, right?
Hmm.
I might just mention, what are you doing now? I mean, I'm not sitting in the rocking chair looking out the window, I can show you that. So I'm on staff at the Mora Presbyterian Church, I'm working with the pastor there, I'm doing visitation in nursing homes. I take the services for him when he's on vacation or for some other reason. He's got a degree in law, he's got a degree in theology, and also in psychology. That's the kind of guy I have to work with. We get along real well, we work together, and we have a great ministry, and I'm missing the service there today because I attended the service with Bruce this morning. Furthermore, I'm also overseeing 2 other Presbyterian churches as a moderator. One at Big Rat and one at Wacom, which is in my area on Mille Lacs Lake. One of those churches is in the building program right now. Building a whole new sanctuary and a new fellowship room. So it's exciting. I'm enjoying it.
I also attended armament school in Denver,
Well, you did.
so he wasn't pulling your leg about firing through the propellers.
Hmm.
Were you at Lowry?
I was at Lowry and I took the armament for bombers.
I took armament for fighters.
Yeah, and from there, I went to aerial gunnery school in Laredo, and they made me an instructor down there. And we always thought you guys that left as ground personnel had safe jobs. We that were flying personnel were a little bit leery. Changed my mind.
It was hairy, that's how I got white hair.
Yeah. Okay, guys, anything else you want to say? Got any experiences?
This depends on me.
I wanted to say, you were talking about the war over there, but it's kind of interesting to know how it affected all of us at home during World War II. And I'm sure there are a lot of people that have a lot of ideas how